Today's daf is daf Mem Beis, and we are studying the Shita of Rabbi Yossi, which we began yesterday. According to Rabbi Yossi, there's something called Osek B'dvar Mitzvah. A person was involved in fulfilling a mitzvah, and as a result, he violated a Chiv Kares B'Sholim. And Rabbi Yossi insists that in such a case, since he's ta'ah, he made a mistake with Dvar Mitzvah, he's parted from a chatos. And the case would be a person who, in our context, carried a lulav out of his private home on his way to either the synagogue or to a rabbi to teach him exactly how to fulfill his mitzvah of nanuim, etc. And inadvertently, while he was on his way to do the mitzvah, he carried the lulav. It was Shabbos on the first day of Succah, and he carried the lulav through a Rishus Harabim. And Abai made the comment that we're talking about a person who has not yet fulfilled his mitzvah. If he has already fulfilled his mitzvah, then that's called shogeg, and he's chayav achatos. But in this particular case, he is on his way to do the mitzvah. He is otzek the mitzvah. He hasn't yet implemented the mitzvah, and he violated the Yisra Hotzah, and he's chayav achatos. Under normal situations, Rabbi Yossi says he's poor.
We don't carry the laws.
Like this is during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, before the Gzeira of Rabbah that we're going to learn about today. So that means that when Shabbos coincided with the first day of Yom Tif, they took the lulav.
Oh, that's during the regular day. Even if they weren't
anywhere in the face of the earth. Yeah, anywhere in the face of the earth, they took the mitzvah.
But you had to bring it before Shabbos.
Correct. And he inadvertently carried it through Rishus Harabim, or from Rishus Yochid into Rishus Harabim on Shabbos. But Abai says if he's already fulfilled his mitzvah, he's no longer considered Osek B'dvar Mitzvah, and therefore he is chayav in the chatos. So the Gemara asks the following question. Wait a second. He's carrying the lulav on his way to do the mitzvah. If that be the case, then he's already fulfilled the mitzvah. Why? Ha mida agbe nafika. The very moment that he lifted up the lulav, he has already fulfilled the mitzvah. So by the time he gets out into the Rishus Harabim, he's no longer osek b'dvar mitzvah. Amar Abai k'shehafacha. Abai says the case that we're dealing with is where he turned one of the minim upside down. And as you recall, we discussed that in order to fulfill the mitzvah, you require kederech gildi lasa, the way it grows. And therefore, he has not fulfilled his mitzvah. Rava gives an alternative. He says, Omar, he was holding on to the daled minim in some sort of a utensil. Let's say he put it down on a large plate. And he has not fulfilled his mitzvah of ulakachtem, because ulakachtem requires that he hold the daled minim in his hand. He's carrying his daled minim in order to get to, let's say, the synagogue, and he goes through Rishus Harabim, he violates Hotzah, but he still has not yet fulfilled his mitzvah, because mida'ag be nothing, means when he lifted the lulav with direct contact with the daled minim. Here, he's carrying a kli, which in turn is carrying the daled minim. So the Gemara says this seems to contradict another position of Rava that we learned about earlier. The Rava hu di'amar, it's Rava himself who said that lekicha l'idei davar acher shma lekicha. That even in a situation where you don't have direct contact with the daled minim, for example, let's say he puts on gloves, beautiful gloves to enhance the occasion. So that's not going to undermine and disqualify his lekicha. The fact that he took gloves onto his hands, and that separates him from touching direct contact with daled minim, Rava says that does not undermine his mitzvah. So you see that if lekicha yidei davarachem shma lekicha, it's considered v'lokach, then why should it bother me if he's carrying the daled minim on a plate and he doesn't have direct contact? Why is that different in the case of wearing gloves? So the Gemara says, Hani, Mili, when does Rava maintain that because he's wearing gloves, it's still considered a viable lekicha and he fulfills his mitzvah, despite the fact that he doesn't have direct contact? That's only derech kavod. When he beautifies his hands by wearing gloves, and we have many cases even in modern contemporary life where people who are involved in a certain service and they are doing something, they will wear beautiful gloves in order to enhance it. And that's called derech kavod. If it's derech kavod, then we can integrate it into one lekicha. So whatever you need, even if it creates some sort of chatzitza between his hands and the dalmin, but nevertheless, it is something that enhances the mitzvah, it's derech kavod, then it's not a chatzitza and it's considered lekicha and he fulfills his mitzvah. Avol derech bizayim. If a man has the dalminin sitting on a plate, for example, then the derech kavod would require of him to pick up the dalminin. It's almost as if he doesn't want to come in contact with dalminin. Leave it on the plate so no one would see that a plate is considered an enhancement of the mitzvah in such a way that it integrates into the lekicha itself. Amar Rav Huna, Omer Hoyer Rav Yossi, Ola Sa'ov Shenimtzeis Ben Agapayim, Ukasavar Chatas Ha'ofi V'Achala Potu. Now Rav Huna is going to take Rav Yossi's principle of Ta'ah B'dvar Mitzvah, and he's going to apply it to a case of someone who inadvertently ate an olas ha'of, an olah, whether it's olas zeva or an olah of a bird, it matters not. It's completely consumed on the mizbeach. And if the Kohen were to eat any part, he would take part of the bird and he would fry it or roast it and then eat it, he would be in violation of the Isa Me'ilah. And he'd be chayv what's called a karma Me'ilah. You may notice in the karbanos that we recite in the morning, there's a whole list of different karbanos of Me'ilah. Me'ilah is one of those karbanos. So if we apply the principle of Rabbi Yossi, in this case, he was osek b'dvar mitzvah. What he was looking for was not an olas ha'of, he was looking for a chatas ha'of. And in the case of a chatas ha'of, then with the exception of a small amount of the oaf, the rest of the oaf is eaten by the Kohanim. He thought that he's being Mekayim a mitzvah. And instead, he was in violation of olas ha'of, eating an olas ha'of, which is, generally speaking, generates a chiyuv karma. Rashi explains that the word agafayim here, if you take a look, Rashi is about 15 lines from the top. Agafayim is Lashon Ophos. Agafayim comes from the word wings. So the Ophos have wings to fly. And Rashi explains that he finds an Olas HaOf, and Nimtzeis Bein Ophos HaMelukim, right, in both Oaf of an Ola and an Oaf of a Chatas, the Kohen does a Malika, and mixed together, this Olas HaOf was mixed with the Chatas HaOf. Now, how did this mixture happen? Rashi is bothered by that. That he mistakenly thought this was a chatas oaf when in truth it was an olas oaf. In fact, that's very difficult because the din is that an olas oaf requires a mitzvah adam on the keren mizrachis dromus, whereas a chatas is on the lower part of the mizbeach, even in the case of an olah, and it's on the Mizrachis Ma'arabis. So you're going from Mizrach on the eastern side to Mizrach on the western side. How did this mixture occur? So Rashi goes on to list 3 karbanos that require what's called Nases al Keren Ma'aravis Tromis, and there are another 3 karbanos, or avodos, that require Keren Mizrachis dromus. And it's a difference between whether it goes on the top part of the Mizbeach, like the Chronos, or on the bottom part of the Mizbeach. So, for example, you'll see, again, we don't have time to go through all the details, but Rashi has 3 karbanos, Chatasov, Hagoshos, Shari Adam. Those are all Lamata. on the bottom part of the Mizbeach. On Lamala, the top part of the Mizbeach is Nisach Hamayim, Nisach Yayin, and Olas Of. So how did this mixture come about? So Rashi tells us that Kshahayu Kohanim Rabim, Omdim Umolkim Ofos Ha'of B'Mizrah. He says that if on the Dromi side, on the east, there was an overflow of Kohanim that were doing Malika, there was a period of Malika, of Olos, then Boim Lamara, then the law is that they shift from the Daram on the Mizrahi side to the Daram on the western side. And right below it are the Chatas Ha'of. So what happened was that the Olas Ha'of fell from the top, because after the Mitzuri, the Of very often slides down the Kira Mizbech, and it slid down and got mixed up with the Chatas Ha'of. He came along the Kohen thinking that he was grabbing onto a Chatas Ha'of, and it turns out to be an Olas Ha'of, for which he's chayav a karba me'ilah if he inadvertently ate the basar of an Olas Ha'of. He thought it was a Chatas Ha'of. And Rabbi Yossi says, and that's exactly where Huda's point is, that in this case he's not chayav a karban. Why? Because he was told b'dvar mitzvah. He thought he was doing a great mitzvah of eating the basar of chatas, when it turns out that he was in fact doing an avera by eating an olah. So the Gemara says, you're telling me that according to Rabbi Yossi's patur, just applying Rabbi Yossi's principle to another case. My kamashmal and the Torah b'dvar mitzvah patur, that Rabbi Yossi maintains that if you're involved in a mitzvah, you don't bring a karma, you don't need a kapara. Hainu hach. That's exactly what Rabbi Yossi said in our Mishnah, that if he takes the lulav in order to fulfill the mitzvah and inadvertently carries it from one rishus to the other, he doesn't bring a chata. It's Torah b'dvar mitzvah. So Rav Huna, with all due respect, are you just giving me another hechatimtza and applying Rav Yossi's principle in this case? Gemara answers, Ma'od Tema. I would have said that there's a fundamental difference between the case of the lulav and the case of achila of olas ha'of. Hasam, in the case of the lulav, the tabitvar mitzvah potter. Why? Hanuti avad mitzvah. At the end of the day, when he took the lulav out of his rishus into the, across the rishus around into the shul, he took the lulav. So he did fulfill the mitzvah. So you could say that anything that happened on the way was ta b'dvar mitzvah. He was osek b'mitzvah. Aval hachal, the ta b'dvar mitzvah lo avid mitzvah. But he never actually did a mitzvah. His mitzvah would have been to eat the basar of a chatas. Instead, he ate the basar of an olah. So he never was mekayim any mitzvah whatsoever. He's got nothing in his hands. Lo, I would say that logically in this case, Rav Yossi's principle of ta b'dvar mitzvah would not apply. Kamash malan, Rav Huna has a great chiddush here. Ta b'dvar mitzvah, v'lo asam mitzvah. Even so, Rav Yossi says he's poter. Meisvei, the Gemara has a kasha from a brayso. Rav Yossi omer hashotet es hatamid she'eno mevukar kilchaso b'Shabbos. So for this, we have to know a sugya about what's called bikur. Bikur means, a Gemara in Erchin and Daf Yud Gimel, deriving from Sukkim, that 4 days before a carbon is brought, we have to examine the carbon, minimum of 4 days before. And Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that if you take an animal that was not examined to be absolutely clear that it's not a trade farm, and you brought it on the Mizbeach without examining it, then the carbon is possible. And this person, a Kohen, is in charge of bringing the carbon tamid, and he brought an animal without bikur. And if that be the case, l'chora he's ta b'dvar mitzvah, and yet chayav chatos v'tzarech tamid ach. He is going to bring a carbon chatos. Now, this case, I have to add a very important point, is Shabbos. What do I mean? The carbon tamid, as you know, is brought every single day of the week, twice a day, and even on Shabbos. The difference between Shabbos and a weekday would be the following. Let's say a Kohen did the avodah, the shechita, etc., of a carbon tamid that was possible if it was during the week. He has to replace it with another carbon tamid, but he hasn't violated Shabbos. He's not chayav a carbon for them. But on Shabbos, the Torah allows Ola Shabbos b'Shabbatot to override Shabbos, but only if it's a carbon kosher. He brought an animal that was not mevukar. It was not subjected to the examination. The carbon is puzzle, and therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, is chayav chatos. This seems to prove that Rabbi Yossi only maintains that Torah b'dvar mitzvah potem in a carbon in a case of avares mitzvah. But in this case, where he brought the carbon and it was puzzled, and he did not fulfill the mitzvah, Rabbi Yossi would agree that he's chayav b'korban chatos. And that undermines the interpretation of Rabbi Yossi that was presented by Rav Huna. Amalei, so Rav Huna responds, Bar minei dahi. The reason why Rabbi Yossi, in this particular case of a Kohen who shechted a carbon tamid without bikur, there's a whole other reason why the principle of Torah b'dvar mitzvah would not apply, and Rabbi Yossi would in this case be machayev achatos. But bar minei, take it outside, so to speak. Don't even ask me a question for this price. But Itmar alom Rav Shmuel bar Chitai, Omar Rav Huna Sama, Omar Rav Yitzchak bar Ashitz, who's Omar Rav Huna Omar Rav, Kegon sheivio min lishka she'enon mivukarim. When they brought sheep and lambs and so forth to the various chambers in the Beis Hamikdash, there was one chamber which was the preparatory chamber. That's where they brought the animals first stage, stage one. And then they brought them after Bikur into another chamber. That second chamber was designated for the lamb or the sheep to be brought on the Mizbech. It already passed its test. It was examined with Bikur 4 days early and found royal Mizbech. This Kohen went into the wrong chamber. He didn't even go into the chamber where the animals were designated after Bikur. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi would agree in this case, that's not called Torah b'dvar mitzvah. He's absolutely negligent here. This is a Shia Mamish. What Kohen would go into that chamber of the early stage, which is before Bikur, instead of going into the chamber? This is a matter of absolute daily protocol, that they went into that chamber of Mivukarim, and that's where they took the animals from. In such a case, if he took one of those animals and it turned out to be a treifa, he would be osek b'dvar mitzvah. You could apply Rav Huna's interpretation of Yossi, and he's part of a carbon. But if chutz b'yak, excuse me the expression, instead of going into that chamber, he took an animal clearly that was not examined, that's his problem. That's his pshia. And in that negligence, even Rabbi Yossi would agree that there's no tour, we cannot exempt him under the law of Torah b'dvar mitzvah. That's not a tos. That's not a shogeg. That's karvel amazing. That brings us to the Mishnah. Mekabeles isha miyad bina umiyad baila. And once again, we're talking about Shabbos before the Gzeira of Rabbah. Today we don't take a lulav on Shabbos, but before the Gzeira of Rabbah, historically, they took the lulav when the first day of Sukkot coincided with Shabbos. They took the lulav on Shabbos. And the halacha was that if you need the lulav for a mitzvah, then when you take the lulav, again, you're not carrying it from one rishus to the other, but when you get the lulav, you're allowed to put it into water. And the reason for that is that when a lulav is kept in water, and that refers to the entire Hoshana, then it protects the lulav, and the lulav is beautiful. But that's only because you're doing it for the sake of a mitzvah. What do I mean? If the lulav is not designated for a mitzvah, then it's muktzah. Why? Because there are two categories of objects in the world that are not muktzah. One is kelim, and the other is ochlim. A lulav is neither a kli nor an ochlim. And the question here is, what's the status of the lulav vis-a-vis a woman? She is exempt from the mitzvah of l'kachtem lachem of lulav under the law of the Zman Brahma. And therefore, for her, the lulav is muktzah. And the Mishnah is machadesh. No, it's not muktzah. And we'll soon see Rashi's explanation as to why it's not muktzah. So number one, she's allowed to receive the lulav. Number two, she's allowed to return the lulav into water. And again, you might know that a lulav, you're not allowed, if it's muktzah, because it's not designated for a mitzvah, it's muktzah, meaning you can't even put it down. So the Mishnah is saying, no, she's allowed to put it down, and that special heter that we allow a lulav for the sake of beautifying the mitzvah to be returned into water. Again, when I say returned into water, I'm being very careful about my choice of words. You're not allowed to take new water, as we'll see in Rabbi Yehuda just a minute, and create a new, pot of water or a vase of water in order to put the daled minim. That far we're not going to allow you to do. That's already a tircha that we don't want you to be involved in that on Shabbos. And again, we're talking about things that grow from the ground. We don't want to put back into the water. It seems like you're planting it. But if you're putting it back into its original water, machziro l'mayim, that we allow for the sake of maintaining the beauty of the lulav.
But I have a question.
Yeah, please.
For the previous mission, bring their lulav Erev Shabbos, Beit Knesset. But here it doesn't sound like they're in the Beit Knesset, something in their home.
Well, then you have a question: how did they get home?
What?
How did they get home? Is that your question? That's an excellent question.
How did they take their lulav from the Beit Knesset back to the
home? Yeah, how could they carry it home? They'd be carrying it through Rosh Hashanah, which you're not allowed to do. Yeah, I would assume that there was water in the shul. I mean, again, I didn't go.
What wife doing? Trying to picture.
So can you extrapolate and say that today on Yom Tov without Shabbos, put the lulav back in?
No, we cannot, right? Because it's muktzah. You can't even touch it. Maybe touch, but you can't move lulav on Shabbos.
No, on Yom Tov, not on Shabbos.
Okay, Yom Tov is more complicated. Again, on Yom Tov, we take the lulav. You're talking about Yom Tov that's not Shabbos.
Right,
No, then it's not.
You can put it back in water.
Right, but as you'll see in Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'Shabbos machzirin, you can put it back into its own water.
Yeah.
But you can't. We're not going to let you do the tircha of taking a new vase and filling it up with water and putting the lulav in. That already looks a little bit too suspicious.
There's always a challenge on
Yom Tov, he's going to allow.
How do you preserve fresh? You put it in foil and
Right.
a towel. So if you can just put it in the water,
Right.
maybe that will sound.
Again, the Rabbi Yehuda is addressing the case with in that historical context where they took the lulav on Shabbos, not in our context. But what's relevant to your question would be the next part of Rabbi Yehuda's statement. Ubi yontif mosifin. On yontif itself, they were more makir. Of course, yontif vis-a-vis Shabbos is lahakel, it's lenient, and therefore they allowed you even to add water or put new water in. And even though it's a little bit of a tircha, but they weren't so careful on yontif with a tircha. And therefore, again, I'm not asking halacha. I didn't look at Shulchan Aruch. I'm just trying to get through the daf. That's my job. We can have a separate cheer in halacha, which I'm sure would be very complicated. But in the Mishnah, at least, it says that on Yom Tov, we're more lenient and we allow you to set up a whole pot of water, a vase full of water, to put your daled minim on Yom Tov. B'moed machlif. Now, there are two different levels here of tircha. One level is mosifin. The water that you prepared before Yom Tov is already getting stale. It's old water. So Rabbi Yehuda says on Yom Tov, it's not such a tircha if you add water, fresh water. But we're not going to allow you to take a new vase on Yom Tov and fill it up with water and put the lulav in. But on Chol HaMoed, which is even more lenient, so we have three levels here. We've got Shabbos, and in Shabbos it's machzirin, but lo mosifim, you can't even add water. Then we have Yom Tov, where it's not only machzirin, but mosifin. You're allowed to add water to mix it with the pre-existing water. And some say it's got to be in the same kelu. He cannot transfer from one utensil to the other. On Chol HaMoed, all holds a bar, meaning we're going to drop all these isurim. We're going to allow you to be what the Mishnah calls machlifin. You could actually change the water, and presumably you could even take a new kli that was not used previously, fill it up with water. The Mishnah ends with the mitzvah of chinuch, to educate the child. Katan hayodel nanea. Once the katan has reached a level that he knows, you can teach him nanuim, chayav belulav. His father has to buy him a lulav. The Gemara now goes back to the question of a woman. And it says in the Mishnah that a woman can receive from her son or from her husband the lulav after it was already used. Shita, why would I think otherwise? She doesn't have the obligation and the mitzvah of lulav. It's his man grama. Is there for ema lo to kabel? I would think she's not allowed to accept the lulav because it's muktzah. So why isn't it muktzah? After all, it's not a kli. It's not an ochel. It's eitzim avonim, what we call in hilchus muktzah, and therefore it should be muktzah. The answer is kamash malan, that it's not muktzah. So Rashi, this is a pella of a Rashi, but Rashi, approximately, should I say, 11 lines up, kamash malan. Even the royal in etilas anoshim, Toras kliolov, umuta v'tiltul lakol. Rashi claims that once it's a kli for them, then it's a kli for everyone. Them referring to the menfolk, they're obligated in lulav, and the mitzvah of lulav removes it from the status of muktzah. It gives it like a quasi kli status. And now, once it gets that status of a kli, and you mafkia muktzah, then even for the women, it becomes a kli, and it's mutal l'tiltul lakol. And all the mafarshim jump on this, because Rashi missed the boat over here. The simple way of learning the Gemara, and this is certainly Rabbeinu Tam, is that a woman can fulfill the mitzvah of daled minim, and she has a voluntary kiyum, what's called Eina Mitzuba V'Osa, even in the case of the Zman Groma. In fact, Rabbeinu Tam goes very far with this. He says that a woman can make a bracha on a cessation. Obviously, it means that she has a kiyum mitzvah. So you don't have to point to the mitzvah. Forget about the mitzvah. It's a kli, it's lulav, it's royal mitzvah, even for the woman, because she can opt voluntarily to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav. So why did Rashi avoid this? And one is tempted to say that Rashi disagrees with Rabbeinu Tam, and he holds like the Rambam and like the Mechaber of Shulchan Aruch, which is the Sephardic minhag, that women did not make a bracha on a mitzvah seiches on grama, and it's not. It's the Torah said she doesn't have this mitzvah. That's it. She doesn't have this mitzvah. It's a time-bound mitzvah. Katan hayodel l'nanea. When we went to the Brisa, Katan hayodel l'nanea chayv belulav. Lis'atev chayv b'tzitzis lishmar tefillin of lokech lo tefillin yodel l'daber of lomdo Torah u'kriyat shema. Now, Rabbosai, the subject of this Brisa is the shear of chinuch. At what age is the child obligated in chinuch? I'm sorry, the father obligated in chinuch. Now, what's common for all these cases in terms of the age of the child for chinuch, and we'll see how, don't ask me from Yodea L'daber. I'll get to Yodea L'daber in a minute, but just let's focus on lulav, on tzitzis, on tefillin. What's common here in this brisa is what I call roi l'kiyum mitzvasa b'shleimus. Is what you call the barest minimum of a mitzvah, and then it's the shleimus of the mitzvah. For example, in lulav, perfect example. You have mida agbe nafik. Once you lift up the dalminim, you are yotze. But that's not the shleimus of mitzvah. The shleimus of mitzvah requires what? Nanuin. The Brisa establishes that at what age a child at the age of 3, whatever, can lift up the daled minim. But ask him to do nanuin, you have to wait till he's 5, 6, 7. He's not royal shleimus of mitzvah. We're not obligated to educate him and train him unless he has reached the age for shleimus of mitzvah. Same thing in tefillin. You can wrap up the tefillin on your hands, maybe a 10-year-old or even less, But shmiras hatefillin, which means that he doesn't sleep in the tefillin, he's not mesiach das, lo yafiach behem, he's shomer mitzvahs tefillin. That's the ultimate kiyum of mitzvah, and that's the mitzvah b'shleimus. And the same thing applies to tzitzis. You could take a 2-year-old and put tzitzis on, but lisatev b'tzitzis, that's already requiring a kiyum of mitzvah of ituf tzitzis. In the case of Torah, the Gemara understands one of two things. Again, I'm offering two alternatives. Either that he's able to understand Torah, he's able to understand the meaning of Kriyat Shema. Or alternatively, what the Gemara is saying is that this category is different than the other three cases. And when it comes to Torah and Kriyat Shema, all we need is the minimum. We don't need the Shleimus HaMitzvah. Because you could have a 20-year-old who doesn't get to the Shleimus HaMitzvah. He hasn't really understood what Kriyat Shema. I don't know if I understand what Kriyat Shema is, right? But at least Yodea L'Dab, that's the barest minimum. And for some reason, unbeknown, Torah and Kriyat Shema doesn't require for chinuch the Shleimus HaMitzvah. All it requires is the bare minimum of the mitzvah. Torah Maihi, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe, Morasha Kehilas Yaakov. So now we're talking about the fact that the pasuk indicates that we want all of Kehilas Yaakov to be involved in Torah. So once a child is old enough to speak, teach the child Torah so we can consider it part of Kehilas Yaakov. And Kriyat Shema Maihi, when you say that he's going to recite Kriyat Shema, he's Yodea L'Daber, can he recite all 3 chapters of Kriyat Shema? No, pasuk Rishon. And again, as we said, all we need is the minimum for Kriyat Shema. And that's the exception to the rule that we established earlier. In a case of most Rishonim, Kriyat Shema, first pasuk is Doraisa. Once you recite Shema till Echad, you have fulfilled your mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. Hayodea Lishma Gufo, the Brisa continues, and if a katan is old enough to watch his body, meaning he doesn't go into an oil which has a corpse in it, he doesn't come in contact with the sheretz, he is very careful not to contract tumah, it's an ochlan al gufo taros. You can take something that's tahar, you could place it on his body, and it remains tahar. Yodea lishmas yadov. There are many things that are metame yodayim, but he knows how to make sure not to come in contact with something that could be metame is yodayim. Like, for example, if you have a vegetable and water fell on the vegetable that's machshir l'kabel tumah, then it could contract tumah. He's very careful about all this. Then ochlan al yodov taros. He can hand you something that has a chazak of being tar, and you can rely on him. Yodea lishon. In a case where he accidentally ended up in an area, whether it's public or private, we'll see in a minute, and there was tumah there was a corpse there, and he knows he's intelligent and mature enough to come in front of the rabbi and say, I don't know, did I contract tumah? Then we apply the following 2 rules. If it's b'shus hayachid sveiko tameh, if we have doubts whether or not he came in contact with tumah and it was in a private domain, then he's tameh. And this we're going to derive from the law of Sota, that if a woman, after she got kinui, she was warned, a married woman was warned by her husband, she went into a private place, and we assume the worst of the worst. She went into a private place with a man that the husband warned her not. And if it's b'shus harabim, if let's say there was a corpse that was laying somewhere in a public domain, and the Gemara in Shabbos tries to define what is a public domain with regard to tumah, it's not necessarily the same as a public domain with regard to hotzah, then sveiko tov. Why? Because again, if a man gave kinui to his wife, don't go into a private place with this man, and she went hanging around with him in a public area, that's not considered us. When I mean it's not usher, I mean to say she's not a soda. Now, if the katan has not yet reached that level, that age where he's intelligent enough to ask the question, then the normal halachas of suffix. So, for example, it could be that even in Rishus HaYachid, we would say that the katan is tar because of his cheskas tara. We knew he was tar before he went in, and we assume he's tar afterwards. Hayodea lifros kapov, If a young Kohen is capable of Nesias Kapayim, and I'm not sure how young he is, might be that he's past bar mitzvah, I don't know, we have to study that, is Cholkelo Truma B'Beis Hagmanos. And then we could give him Truma. He's going to protect the Truma. And we said, if you recall, that there's a mitzvah of Shmiras Truma. Now, why do we have to wait until he is Noseis Kap? So the Mepharshim explain, all based on Rashi, that we need to make a public statement that this child is capable of Nesias Kapayim, meaning he's capable of a higher, mature level. If he hasn't been Noseis Kapov, then the people, the public, have a room to suspect that maybe he's not ready for Shmira. And therefore we can't give him Truma. It would be a chilul, a desecration of Kedushas Truma if we gave him Truma, unless he has publicly announced, so to speak, demonstrated that he's reached the level of Shmira. And therefore he's capable of protecting the Truma.
Different for each child.